Okay, just a couple more seconds here and then we'll get going. Thanks for being patient, everybody. All right, well, welcome to our Revamp Your Career in the New Year webinar. I'm Patrick Mullane. I'm the Executive Director of HBS Online and HBS Executive Education. It's wonderful to be here with you all. Many of you I've met either in person or virtually through the years, so it's great to see you here. And for those who are new to something like this, we hope you enjoy it and look forward to sharing some thoughts with you regarding career and career management. So today we're going to change it up a little bit. Often I'm the one being interviewed, but I'm going to do the interviewing today. And I have with me Stephany Matos. And Stephany is a talent acquisition manager. She's worked in a role like this for a while. She's been with HBS Online for a year and has worked across Harvard for about 6 years. She went to the University of Massachusetts here in Boston, and she earned a degree in human services and a minor in business communications. Using the talent she's got with respect to resumes and career development, she volunteers with several nonprofit organizations to review resumes and provide input to help underrepresented groups be more marketable with respect to finding a job and increase their economic mobility. So if you are looking to really do the same thing, that's kind of what we're here for today. We're looking forward to answering your questions. We have several that were actually more than several that were submitted in advance that we've kind of lumped them into some broad categories and are going to go through and answer them. And then we'll answer some questions live as well as we go through this program. So Stephany, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Awesome. It's great to see you. And by the way, so Stephany and I have the same backgrounds. This is a view from one of our executive education buildings in a conference room that looks out toward campus. I can't stand the winter and the snow, because I grew up in Texas, so I'm trying to be a little more optimistic, I guess. And I have a fall image behind me, whereas Stephany has a more accurate image with respect to how campus looks today. So Stephany, let's get going here. An obvious first question is, if you're considering a career change, where do you start? What should you be thinking about if that's something you're looking to do as a New Year's resolution?
Yeah, I think when you're considering a career change, a good place to start is just asking, take a step back and ask yourself, why are you considering a change? Are you maybe ready to step into management or a leadership role, whether that's within or maybe outside of your current organization? Are you looking for an organization that better aligns with maybe your skill set, your values? Are you interested in kind of just pivoting industries completely? You might be re-entering the workforce after a period of time and need to upskill. So just figuring out what the motivation is a good start. And then from there, you want to set measurable goals so you can determine, where you're headed, make an action plan. That way you're able to also track your progress along the way.
So you bring up something that's very interesting. It occurred to me as you were answering the question, brought it up indirectly, is I've seen people before who hate their jobs and use that as a motivating factor to get a new job, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. Obviously, you don't need to stay in a terrible situation, but often they've gone from the frying pan into the fire, right? That they've been propelled away from something, but they didn't give a lot of thought to where to go. So if you're in that kind of bad headspace, any thoughts on, any more specifics on how to kind of distance yourself from that and make good decisions?
I think you want to focus on the positives or focus on what you do want to see in a new employer, and prepare lots of good questions to, use the interview or even the phone screen to figure out, is this the right place for me? You can use those times intentionally. So I think you know what you don't want. So let's focus on what you do want, and do these other places meet kind of those expectations you're looking for?
Yeah, good point. In fact, I think that I have similar advice, because I think that if you just use that as the only thing you're thinking about, you have a higher risk of ending up in something you don't like again. And then if you leave that job, now you have an issue with, and I think we'll have a question about this later, an issue with just having a resume that has a whole bunch of hopping from place to place as you're trying to find your place. Exactly. I know it's easy to say when you're in a job you like, and I like my job, but it can, I think, help to be patient there. You alluded to talking, having good questions when you go for an interview. By the way, for those, forgive me, I'm looking to my right here because I have two screens set up and I had some notes I wanted to reference. So if you're ready to make a career change, how do you stand out? What do you think people sometimes miss or forget when it comes to standing out when you're trying to make a transition?
Yeah, so one good place to start, I think, is to identify those transferable skills. And so by that, I mean, skills you've picked up throughout your professional career that you can apply these to your next role. They're not necessarily like industry specific. So essentially, you're taking qualities and skills from previous jobs to market yourself. So just as an example, we had a candidate who was interested in pivoting from being a K through 12 educator to content development. And so I recall the candidate highlighted key skills such as curriculum design, writing, research, project management, their expertise in certain tools in Microsoft Suite. So they had also highlighted a recent certificate they completed in instructional design, and they did a really good job in their cover letter articulating how their experience as an educator, the recent certificate related to the content developer role that we were recruiting for. And so, ultimately they were hired and were able to transition and pivot industries successfully. So I just think one of the key takeaways here is just being intentional about the way you market yourself, using the real estate on that resume and the cover letter in a way that is, shows, is compelling. It can really be impactful for sure. I've seen it firsthand.
Do you think, as somebody who's reviewed a lot of resumes, are you able to kind of pull that out when people don't do that? Do you know what I mean? Or is it a case where, yeah, you could, but you're just busy and you've got a lot of resumes, so you got to make it easy on the person reading the resume?
Absolutely. It's definitely clear when someone does take the time to do that. I think it definitely makes it easier on us. We do a lot of reading, so it certainly makes it easy. However, if someone does have good experience on their resume, we'll use the phone screen, which, that takes place before interviews. We'll use the phone screens to dig deeper if, the resume, stands out to us. Right. But it helps if it's, addressed somewhere.
Yeah, in fact, yeah, it's an obvious answer, I guess, for people, but, don't make it harder than it has to be because you're in competition. And by the way, and I've, written about this in this Forbes column I do where I talk about the fact that many, particularly younger people in industry, haven't had to go through a downturn. And while it might have been easy to just kind of throw out a resume that was halfway done and a cover letter that was halfway done or not done at all, might have worked in the past when there were 10 applicants for one position, that when that's not true, in other words, when there's one applicant, or excuse me, when there are 10 applicants for one position, then it becomes much more necessary for you to find ways to make it easy on the recruiter. Do Stephany a favor, make it easy.
Yeah, and another way to stand out, I think, is just identify what your areas of weakness are and then determine what you can do to build on those skills. So just, for example, at HBS Online, we are seeing learners who they want to accomplish a very specific thing. They want to prepare maybe for a promotion within their organization. So they might need to brush up on their leadership skills, or they might want to pivot careers. So they want to learn more about business strategy, for example. So I think first, just identify what your growth areas are. And from there, you'll be able to determine, the skills you might need and research the options that are available to you. And then, once you do complete those, you want to include that on your application materials as well.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I know it's a little self-serving because we do educational certificates here, but I get often asked from people who are applying to the MBA program, like, does it help me if I take a course before I come to the MBA, apply to the MBA program? And to the extent that applying to an MBA program is like applying for a job, you're applying for a job to be a student, and you have to be selected by somebody. Absolutely. I would say it's not one of those things that's necessarily you have to do it, but it certainly is nice for a tiebreaker because it shows that you're motivated. Like this person who took an instructional design course, it shows that you're motivated to get into the field you're trying to get into. So if you had an engineering background and you took a business course, that's helpful when you're applying to an MBA program because it shows you have motivation to learn business stuff. Exactly. I think that's really important. We have a question, and forgive me from those of you who might be watching. I think it's Jesse. It could be Jess on Zoom. What advice do you have for breaking into a new industry, and how can I build my management skills? So breaking into an industry, you touched on a little bit. I think that's that transferable skill stuff. Any other thoughts on things that people should consider when they're trying to completely pivot from one industry to another?
Yeah, so definitely highlighting the skills you do have. Are there any special certificates or degrees you might need for this particular industry? So researching what you need to do to achieve that, and putting a plan in place for that. Certainly when I'm reviewing resumes, I'm looking for, what degrees, what certificates you have. I'm looking at the resume and your work history holistically. So there are certainly ways to do that successfully. We've seen it many times here, but you just have to be intentional, know kind of where you're headed.
Yeah, and to that intentionality, one thing I'd recommend on this too is that in a cover letter to address it head on. Like if you're going from being you want to go from being an airline pilot to a K through 12 teacher, or to a manager of a fast food joint or something. Anytime there's this huge, I think, what looks like a disconnect just in a vacuum, you need to provide a story around it to help somebody understand, because whether it's fair or not, it does matter. People will wonder, well, why do you want to make a change like that? It's not even related to what you're doing today. So just, I think being upfront about it really, really kind of helps a lot.
Absolutely. And being prepared to answer that question, because if it is a very drastic change, most likely they will ask you what your motivations are. So I think just preparing to respond to that.
Yeah, and the second part of this question about building management skills, I'll throw some ideas there. One is just to read about management and leadership to the extent that it's possible for you. Obviously, again, I'm biased here, but taking courses and it helps. The other thing that I think is most important, frankly, is practice. You need to put yourself in a position where you're going to get the opportunity to manage and take feedback from those who have done it as to how you're doing and improve based on that feedback. And you'll find that will pay huge dividends down the road. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Stephany.
No, I think you definitely have the key points there.
Okay, so variation on, well, all these are variations on each other, obviously, because we're talking about a similar topic, but your resume is ready. You feel like, hey, this looks great. People have reviewed it. It's nice and polished. Then what?
So something you should do, I think, very regularly, even when you're not necessarily job seeking, is updating your resume throughout the year. It can be easy to forget, what were some of those accomplishments you had. Maybe you implemented a new tool for your department. It helps streamline a process, increase productivity. Maybe you increase the percentage of engagement on a social media platform. Either way, it's just very important to capture the impacts you've made. It can be easy to forget if you're not updating, your resume regularly. Include metrics if you can. They certainly help communicate your impact as well. And then just in terms of things recruiters look for when evaluating a resume, I'm looking at a resume to see if a candidate is qualified for the role. I'm looking, again, as I mentioned earlier, I'm looking at the resume and the work history holistically. I'm looking for transferable skills. What degrees or certificates does this person have? And, in most cases, you really don't need to have 100% of the qualifications listed on the job description. A lot of people self-eliminate because they think they need to meet every single requirement. But that's just not true. However, do use the cover letter to address the qualifications you do meet, and then your interest and ability to learn the rest. So you want to communicate that.
I'm curious, do you, because I've noticed this when I interview, and maybe this is a Patrick Mullane thing, but regarding metrics, let's say somebody says verbally in the interview, I increased revenue by $4 million. Does that answer feel significantly different to you, and in what way? If they instead said we, like, you were involved in it, but you were part of a team, because almost always that's the case. And I'm curious if you have the same impression. And by the way, we have not rehearsed this, so I don't know what our answer is going to be. But
so this does happen in interviews, and so often we well, not often, we want to know what you did, what you contributed. And so if someone answers a question with a lot of we follow up. Well, what did you contribute to this, or what was your role in this? So we do ask, certainly. So
yeah, and it's funny because I was going to go the other way. Is that I also have flags go up if you say you're relatively junior position and you say I increased revenue by $1 billion, at TikTok or something. I don't make it up. It's unlikely you did it by yourself. And I always like to see a little humility in realizing that you're a member of a team, because, one thing I know we agree on is that having somebody who is all in it for themselves never works out well. So, but I think you're right. You shouldn't be shy either.
Yeah.
about touting what you've done and answering the question directly.
Yeah, I think communicating your role is important. And also, yeah, if it was a collaborative effort, include that too. I think it just depends on the nature of the work that you're interviewing for.
Yeah, and clearly there are individual contributor roles where it was all you. I don't want to minimize those. And I guess it comes back to that thing. It's just be honest. If it was a team effort, be honest about your contributions and what other people did. And it was all you, then sure, it was all you. Don't be shy about that. We have a question from, it looks like Sharon Baden, sorry if I pronounce it wrong, Sharon, on Zoom as well. And we had a few questions come through on this in advance too. You and I discussed some of them. And the question is this: any advice on ageism concerns or higher degrees that employers may view as overqualified, yet you fit all the requirements and have great enthusiasm for the job or company that you want to pivot toward? So I think two questions here is the ageism question, but they often go hand in hand, which is, I've been in the market for a while. I have a lot of great skills, but now I want to do something where people tell me I'm overqualified. How do you handle that?
Yeah, so that definitely happens. I think that, again, it goes back to preparing and being preparing to answer that question, because it might come up in some way, maybe directly or indirectly, but preparing for that, right? And so in terms of ways to maybe prevent someone maybe assuming your age, there are ways to kind of eliminate that even at the resume level. And I don't want to get too deep into the legal stuff, but, you can exclude the year you graduated. I mean, if the role you're applying for requires a degree, that will be verified when we do background checks. You don't have to include the year that you graduated if you don't want to. Sometimes even simple things as like the email address you use, sometimes it does tell your age. If you're using maybe like AOL or like Hotmail, it does. Unfortunately, those are ways someone can kind of tell your age. And you can't discriminate against age, but people do have unconscious bias is a thing. So I think there are ways to maybe prevent that.
Yeah, we talked about this earlier, and I had to laugh about the email thing. It sounds like something I would do. Here's my beeper number or something like that. So certainly, and again, this an important point, and Stephany alluded to it, is that it's not in the United States, and we should be clear here, because some countries the laws are different. In the United States, you're not allowed to ask questions that probe at things like age legally. But the fact of the matter is that people will make assumptions. And so if you think that's going to be an issue, you need to get ahead of it by doing all you can to not make it a discussion point, because you don't point to things that will validate or their biases going in. As far as being overqualified, I think that the key there is to make sure, again, you have a story about why, if it looks like you're taking a step back, quote unquote, in your career, why you're doing that. And I think there's perfectly legitimate reasons why people want to do that. So just make sure you're clear about that. Okay, so you've got the job interview, and you're sitting in the room. What do you do to impress the hiring manager?
So there are a lot of things I think you can do to just prepare for an interview. You definitely want to rehearse common interview questions. You want to essentially, practice not only the interview questions, but also the answers. Use the STAR method. Most recruiters are using behavioral-based interview questions because we want to hear real examples or situations you've encountered and how you handled them. And so for those of you who may not know, the STAR method stands for situation, task, action, and results. So you just want to make sure that, when you're practicing your responses, they hit on all of those key points.
Yeah, if you don't do that, I think that gets back to what we were talking about, is you don't tell a good story, because that's the STAR method is all about that, really, is to kind of set the context, tell the tale, and see what the results were. Yeah. And if you don't do that in a structured way, it can get kind of muddled. I also like your comment about rehearsing. I used to make flashcards. Like, I knew questions I was going to get, and I'd put little bullet points on the back of a flashcard and practice it, and then would bounce it off a friend or my wife, and I found it helped immensely.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Another thing that just at HBS Online in particular that I find candidates, they really stand out when they come to an interview, they're really prepared because they went through our website and they did our research. So, our website, it states our mission, our case-based learning model. There's an FAQ section. We offer sample business lessons. So when a candidate comes into an interview with that research done, they are just like literally so many benefits. We find that they are much more informed about our products. The sample business lessons, they might give them a preview of maybe this is a course that they'll work on. But I think if you take a step back, I think what's most important about that is that it demonstrates some of those really desirable soft skills that employers are seeking. So I think it shows you're taking initiative, you have a desire and a willingness to learn, you know how to research and seek solutions. It also demonstrates curiosity. And Patrick, I recently read an article that you wrote for Forbes, and you shared how your curiosity, it led you to become a private pilot on the weekends, and how, without curiosity, you can't be a critical thinker. And critical thinking is certainly a very desirable soft skills that employers value. I couldn't agree more. I thought it was a very timely read. But in any case, when candidates do all of that, not only do they stand out to the hiring team, but now the candidate has a much better understanding of what we do as an organization. And in turn, they are able to ask their interviewers really thoughtful questions. And that really just does a good job demonstrating also just how enthusiastic they are about, the work that we're doing. So I think it's just a win-win, and that strategy, it can be applied to any employer you're interviewing with. So I think the key things here are just research, rehearse, practice, and ask questions. You definitely want to ask questions in an interview.
Yeah, the questions, by the way, is a big bugaboo of mine. You have to ask them. The analogy's used a lot, but I think it's a fair one. Is like, if you went on a date and the person you're on a date with is in transmit mode only, they're only talking about themselves, that usually doesn't work out well. There needs to be an exchange of information. It should be true in a job interview too. And if you're there will come a point with which you're asked, do you have any questions for me? You always should have questions. And the other thing is, people think they can't ask questions that they already asked somebody else and got an answer for. I would actually encourage people to not be shy about that. If you interview with more than one person in a company, it's okay to ask them all the same question or questions. In fact, it's a great way to see if you get a consistent answer, which tell you something about the company.
I agree.
So, yeah, I wouldn't be shy about that at all. And thanks for plugging my Forbes article. Then maybe somebody other than my mom will read it. So you touched a bit on this already, but any more thoughts on the best ways to convey your skills in an interview? Particularly when you think about the soft skills versus hard skills, and a lot of people I know don't like soft skills, but like the essential skills, I've heard them called. But any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, if the interviewer does not ask you a question to something that you think is really important, that you want to make sure they're aware of, be prepared to somehow insert it in the conversation. You want to highlight that, whether it's, I just, got this degree or this certificate, or, there might be something in particular you want to emphasize. And so if you're not prompted to answer that, find ways to include it in the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm curious, and again, since we didn't rehearse this, forgive me if I'm going to stump you on this one, and put you on the spot. What's the worst thing you've ever seen in an interview, or the most, like, the thing that made you went, wow, I can't believe that just happened? Do you have one?
Yes, I can definitely think of one. So at least with HBS Online, typically we meet with folks for 30 minutes, sometimes 45, if we're maybe on a panel. And so sometimes folks take a really long time answering one question, and they're like,
yeah, you can't let it go, like, and you run out of time.
Yeah, so you're running out of time. And so we're not able to ask all of the questions that we had to make an assessment on whether or not you will be a successful candidate. So with that being said, and I had to find ways to kind of interject and kind of redirect the conversation. So again, practice your responses, try to be as concise and clear as possible, and make sure that it relates to, one, the question they asked, and also to the role in being successful in that role.
Actually, that's a really great example, because I'm sure other organizations do it too. And just to be clear, I think when you're talking about those 30 minutes, typically it's because you're going to talk to like 5 people, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And so you don't want to run out of time in being able to communicate your message to all those folks. So I think it's a really great point. I had one that I think is an indication of making sure you understand the context of what you're doing. I was working in a startup and was interviewing somebody who showed up for the first interview, and this is like at 7:30 at night, and everybody's still in the office working. And by the way, I'm not saying that you need to do that. I'm just saying clearly that was the culture of this place, because it was a startup trying to get a product out the door. And the person I was interviewing, when I asked if there's any questions in the very first interview, asked me how many days of vacation they got, because they really liked their vacation. Now, one of the cardinal rules I've always read is you don't talk about your benefits in the first interview, which I think is generally good advice. And then I kind of was so flabbergasted. I'm like, look around, there's people in here, that are working nonstop. And again, I'm not judging that, because that environment isn't good for everybody. You don't want to work 24/7. You want to have work-life balance. And maybe that's why she said it, because she wanted it and she knew that would be a question where I'd be perplexed. Yeah. But make sure you understand the context, when you go in. This gets back to the research you were talking about.
Exactly. And, just talking about research, most companies, I think, have that information available on their website. So you might be able to just find that out on your own.
Right. And frankly, there's tools now that didn't exist when, certainly this happened, which is, like Glassdoor and things like that, where you can get a sense of, what the cultures of companies are like. Exactly. Although I would also say, don't, especially if there's not many reviews, don't take a few bad ones to heart, because in small organizations, a few disgruntled folks can really, sway the narrative. A question from LinkedIn, and I think it's Danique S. Do you think that companies find soft skills less important compared to hard skills? And actually, can you just define for everybody? I think most people probably know, but just in case, what we mean by soft versus hard.
Yeah, so soft skills are, things that I described, earlier. So, showing that you know how to take initiative, that you can multitask, prioritize, whereas hard skills are, these are skills you've learned through, training, a degree, technical, just as an example. And so I'm sorry, what was the question?
Oh yeah, and I forgot you had already mentioned that before, so I apologize too. It's, do you think companies find soft skills less important to hard skills?
Well, I will say at HBS Online, no, we definitely value both. So when we are, when we're asking interview questions, in many cases, a lot of those questions are around some of those soft skills to determine whether or not, you can perform some of these tasks. This is a very dynamic environment. And so, we might want to figure out, can this person, shift gears and, do they know how to prioritize? And so for us, we certainly value both, for sure.
Yeah, and I always answer that question by, this is a personal philosophy for me, but it served me well as a hiring manager for 30 years, is if I've got two candidates and they're exactly the same, and obviously this never happens in real life, but if they're exactly the same, the only difference is one has, on a scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is the best, one has soft skills of a 9, but has hard skills of, say, a 6. And the other person has hard skills of a 10, but soft skills of a 3. I'm taking the soft skills higher rated person every time, because I do think it matters that much. Because to your point, it gets to things like teamwork and empathy and communication skills, all these things that really, if you're the smartest person in the world, but you can't do those things, it really doesn't matter.
Exactly.
It depends to some extent on the role too, by the way. I mean, if all you're going to do is code in a room by yourself, maybe it's not.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think that the scope certainly matters. But again, there are ways throughout the recruiting process that you can demonstrate those soft skills. Certainly you can include that, on your resume or, in your application materials, but there are ways to showcase that. And so you're almost kind of like interviewing in a way, because you're showing you can do some of these things already.
Speaking of that, is another way to do it, and I don't know how you feel about them, but letters of reference, because you have somebody else talking about how you demonstrated skills, or do you find them kind of, particularly if somebody shows up with them, do you find them useful, or how do you think about them?
Yeah, so we actually use a software to do the reference checks. And so there is like an open feedback part of it. And so that is where let's say we have, multiple finalists. And so we kind of have lingering questions or, aren't sure. We do look at that to see what other references have to say about them and how they work together. And so, it certainly is important for sure.
All right. So now you've got the job. You impressed in the interview, you asked all the questions. How do you start out strong?
Yeah, I think that if maybe one-on-ones with your manager, if those aren't already kind of part of your onboarding process, which they should be, but if it's not, be proactive, set one up, prepare an agenda, send it to your manager ahead of time, so that way they can look at it and see if maybe they have input, and they can also prepare to answer any of the questions you might have. But use that time to define, what are the goals, what are the priorities, where do you want to see me in the next 90 days? So I think that also shows initiative as well. And then also, you can also set up one-on-ones with your colleagues, whether it's, folks on your teams, maybe folks you might work across other teams. That's a good way to, I think, make connections as just a new person. Ask lots of questions. I think those are definitely 3 things you can do to start. Is there anything you can think of, or maybe is there anything you've seen someone do that like stood out to you?
First of all, what you said, I think, is the exact right thing to do. I agree. And all I was going to say is that came to me as you were speaking is that I think in some ways that path has become even more important because of remote work. It's so easy to be isolated, and at the risk of sounding like an old man here, I do think a lot of young professionals underestimate the value of connecting with their bosses and mentors, people who can be mentors and so forth in person. That doesn't happen well online. I would even argue, even if you have a fully remote job, you ask about the opportunity on some regular basis to, if there is a home office, sometimes there isn't, but if there is, to touch base. And if there isn't some sort of home office, that there's a way for you to maybe get people in your region who are close by together for a social hour or something. I do worry a lot about what the remote work revolution, is still in process. We'll see how it all works out. That it's been pretty isolating for people. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal recently too that notes that it's made it a lot easier for companies, frankly, in some cases, to do layoffs and or firings because they feel comfortable just sending an email, which seems kind of
impersonal.
Impersonal. It's really impersonal. I agree 100% with you. Nobody cares about your career and your development more than you. So do things that are, and your success more than you. So do things that are going to increase the chances that happens. Just 2 questions from Zoom about the etiquette around reaching out before the interview for clarification or afterward for feedback. Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure what they mean by clarification. Is it about the job itself, the job description? So I guess I would need a little more context there. In terms of asking for feedback, I welcome it. Just me personally, if I have a candidate who, they had a good interview, or maybe they felt like they didn't have such a good interview, and maybe they're going on to a second round and they ask for feedback, I certainly appreciate them asking, because I'm happy to help them do better for the next time. Maybe something that they didn't notice. So for example, how I mentioned, someone, they took a long time to answer one question. If they ask for feedback, I would say, next time around, maybe can you try to be a little more concise and make sure you're tying it all back to the role that you're applying for. So
this candidate wasn't named Patrick, was he? You're not talking about
no. And this actually happens. It happens quite often. So I don't have one particular person in mind, but it does tend to happen.
I've seen it a lot, and often it's pretty obvious to me that it has more to do with nerves than the way the person really is. So, but I think you're right that practicing it, just being succinct, answering the question, and then giving them opportunity to move on, I think is key.
Yeah.
And on the context on the reaching out before the interview, I don't have any more context either. But one thing I will say is, if there's a lack of clarity about something you need to conduct the interview well, then sure, ask a question. If you're just doing it to look like you're being engaged, I think there's a risk of looking like you're annoying. You got to be careful. If it's unclear, that you might need to pass through a security checkpoint, and hey, do I need to have my driver's license with me? I think, of course, those are the sorts of things you should ask. If you're asking for the detailed background of 3 people who are interviewing with you, what their hobbies are or something, because you think it'd make it easier to make conversation with them, I don't think that's a good idea. So
I agree.
it's hard to answer, but just use good judgment there. let's see, we have, how do you find, and this is from, oh, tough name, sorry, Yashvardhan Gusani. Hopefully I got that close. How do you find mentors who can guide your career, career-wise versus professionally? From experience, I have found it extremely challenging to find someone who can ask the right questions for you to be introspective and lay out a 5 to 10 year career plan. Any thoughts? Well,
I think that for the most part, people enjoy helping others. So I think instead of looking for a mentor, perhaps, you came across someone on LinkedIn, maybe they're in an industry or a role you're interested in, so I think asking for a 20-minute like coffee chat or a quick Zoom, that's not a huge commitment on their end. And so starting with that might be a better strategy. And, if someone does accept an invitation, you want to come prepared. And again, I know I'm saying this word a lot, but you want to be intentional about how you're using their time. So if you have 20 minutes, prepare some questions that are really important to you. And then maybe a mentorship will grow organically from there. But I think asking for, a quick chat might be a better strategy.
That is a fantastic answer. I didn't know what you were going to say, obviously, but I couldn't agree more. In fact, this idea of a formal mentor is relatively new. When I was in my first jobs, nobody ever talked about this. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. In fact, it happened. It might have happened more because I think it was much more organic. And it's kind of what you're talking about is I've been asked directly before to be a mentor, and that always feels a little intimidating to me because I don't know, I'm busy. I don't want to let them down. Exactly. Whereas an initial exploration where we see if we click, where I feel like I've added value to the conversation for you, and you feel like you liked, communicating with me. And then you say at the end of that, hey, do you mind if I ping you, every 3 months or 4 months and do this again? And 90% of the time, if I think it went well, I'm going to say yes. Exactly. And the word mentor is never mentioned, but you're getting the value. So
exactly.
I wouldn't fixate on the title as much as the return on investment.
Yeah. I mean, I think people, we're all busy. And so I think, we don't know what that commitment might entail. And so a quick Zoom, a quick coffee chat in person, that's not a huge commitment on their end. I think someone would be quicker to accept that type of invitation.
Yeah, and we have a last question here, and then we'll wrap it up. That I'll take a hack at because I have some thoughts on it, and it was submitted in advance, and it was about managing growth opportunities and moving up higher in your organization. A lot of questions around how do I eventually become a CEO or something like that. And I've lived this because I've been a CEO in my life, and I guess my job sort of right now is like a CEO, we don't call it that. And this is another area where I think people sometimes are almost too fixated on the title. If you seek out expanding leadership opportunities and perform well at them over time, you'll wake up one day and find that you may not be the CEO, but you'll be in a senior management position. And so rather than really fixating on the title piece of it, I think fixating on the work and increasing responsibility in your work. And when I say increasing responsibility, inevitably that comes with having more and more people to manage, which is the hard part of any job. If you can get that right, then the opportunities will come. So really focusing on that, this is Patrick Mullane opinion, is the way to get there. It's okay to have in some journal somewhere that someday you want to be a CEO. I mean, I wanted to do that, but I tried to not get hung up on the exact path to get there, and rather fixated on the things I thought would give me the skills and capabilities that there was no other choice but for it to happen because I had those skills at the right time. So I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that, Stephany.
I think maybe not necessarily CEO, but in terms of, maybe redefining someone's current role, they're looking for growth opportunities. You definitely want to make sure your manager knows what you bring to the table, what your long-term goals are, that you're interested in expanding your scope of responsibilities. I think you can use maybe even your annual performance reviews to highlight your accomplishments throughout the year, talk about maybe professional development opportunities. But I think the key here is also, communicating your value, your skills, and your interests or your goals.
Yep, couldn't agree more. And I think that, there's a lesson there in both answers about, being intentional, as you've said over and over again, but not so intentional that it's this script you're just checking boxes. You got to have some intentionality, but also do the hard work and spend the time. This is one thing, again, I've written about too, is I think more junior employees have been taught to take charge of their own careers, which on balance is a really good thing. But sometimes you need time in a role before you can get to the next one. So, if you're 6 months into a job and asking for your, a promotion that, raises you 3 levels or something, that's probably unrealistic. And I'm exaggerating a bit here, but sometimes not too much. So, that said, it's also true, and I've said this to people inside of our organization. Look, if at some point you've developed a lot of skills and you've really broadened your horizons, and even if we see it, but there's just no role. I mean, we can't create one if there's not a need for it. Then I never harbor any ill will to people who decide they need to move on to go do something else. I've done it before in my life, so don't also feel like you're wedded forever to the same place, even if you thought you might stay there forever. You got to do what's right for you. But again, like everything, just be judicious, because you don't want to like you're hopping every year from one thing to another. That does make it a little harder to land the next gig. Well, thank you a million, Stephany. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
And we should do this more just to catch up.
I agree.
Well, everybody out there in the webosphere, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. We love doing these things. We love to hear your feedback. So please connect on social channels and let us know what you thought. And good luck with whatever you're dealing with when it comes to your career, and best of luck to you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.